Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for watching my videos, and I appreciate the new subscribers for subscribing my channel. Right, apologies for the infrequent updates. I have been working, and to be honest, I have like a new change of job. So yeah, time is a bit tight on my end. But well, let's begin. Hi, I'm Rodi Chia, and you're watching this on my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to cover this very unusual topic on margin debt. I'm sure some of you may have heard of this thing called margin debt. Margin debt is a very interesting tool, right? I won't say that it's a weapon, right? I won't say that it is an evil, but I would say that it's a very useful financial tool if put into the right effect, right? In recent years, there have been various new financial products being released, and let's have a look at what this thing about margin debt really is about, right? I'm sure some of you have been reading the news and you have read of this terms such as deleveraging. Right? You probably have heard of this term, deleveraging. You may probably have heard of, that investors have been using a lot of leveraging. Right? Now, what are these things actually about? Well, it comes to this thing called margin, right? And today we're going to understand what margin does, and how does it help the investor to make money, and how does it end up resulting in value destruction. And last of all, we're going to cover this little thing about what can we do to construct an invulnerable margin portfolio, right? And then we come to a close. All right. Now, opinions expressed in this video are purely those of my own. It doesn't represent those of any institutions. But if you wish that I explain this maybe with respect to certain specific products, do let me know. Alright? Okay, so what exactly is margin debt or margin loan? So there are quite a few names given to it. One is margin loan, margin borrowing. Now, so to define this, a margin loan basically is a type of loan that allows a share investor to be able to invest in a size larger than what he would have been able to. For example, if he had $100 of cash on hand, and if the bank were to offer him a margin facility giving him the ability to invest 3.5 times with that 100, that means he would be able to invest in $350 of shares. And that sounds quite amazing, which means that instead of you investing just 100, you now are able to invest in $350 of shares. Of course, this ratio can vary, right? What if this is a ratio of 10 times? If this facility gives a ratio of 10 times, it means that the investor is able to invest in up to $1,000 of shares, which is incredible, right? So that's how the term margin came about, because you're only paying, or you're using only a fraction of that money to invest in that size which you wanted. Alright? And without such a margin facility, it would be impossible for you to invest in 1,000. Let's say if you really only had 100, then there is no way you can invest in 1,000 if you only had 100 on hand, unless this margin facility comes in and gives you 10 times of whatever money that you have on hand. So 10 times 100 gives you 1,000. Now, you may say, then that sounds wonderful. So what's the problem with that? Okay, we'll look at both sides of the story, right? So obviously, if the investor doesn't have such a facility, then the most he can invest is only $100. That's it. That's all he can do, right? Obviously, with a much larger capacity to invest, the investor is able to invest and capitalize on market bull runs. Which means that imagine if he had 100 to invest in a bull run versus $350 to invest in a bull run, the difference is drastic. Imagine being able to make 10% of 100 versus 10% of 350. Right? And out of the 100, the most you can make is $10, whilst if you had a margin facility, then the amount that you can make is $35. Now that is a drastic difference, and that is the power of margin loan, right? Now I'm not giving you that that conclusion that you should use margin because it gives you that extraordinary return, right? Let's finish talking about this, then you come to your own conclusion. Right, so let's look at what are the wonders of margin facility. Let's say, for example, if you were to go to the bank and the bank told you that okay, they're going to allow you to be able to invest with a ratio of 1 to 1. Okay, what that means is that for every $1 of equity that you have, the bank will give you another dollar of loan so that you can invest in whatever shares that you want. So let's say you had $175, and that means you would be able to borrow $175 from the bank, or the bank would lend you the $175 to invest. That gives you a total of $350 of purchasing power to purchase in shares, right? Assuming that if you were to make 10% gain from that $350, tomorrow your portfolio will be worth $385. Okay? Now observe here, while the portfolio value may have increased, the value of your debt remains constant, right? Although you observe that portfolio value has increased, but that value remains the same. Okay, however, in terms of the value of your equity, the value of your equity has depreciated by exactly $35, right? Now, you notice that today your limit would be is actually 1 to 1. If we use the formula of A divided by B, A divided by B, so it would be 2 times. Now, the next day when the portfolio value has increased to $385 with the same amount of debt, your margin limit changes to 2.2. Now, what is the purpose of this margin limit? This margin limit is actually quite important, because it actually, based on this, the bank then computes how much available limit to finance new share purchase. So the bank may have a certain mechanism to tell you that, okay, so long as you maintain above 2, then the bank, so long as you have more than 2, the bank would be able to give you more limit to purchase shares. That sounds incredible, isn't it? Alright. Now, however, the problem comes when the market went the other way round. If the market had went the other way round, then you have a slight problem. Let's say, for instance, in this case, you had invested in a portfolio similar to the earlier example. You invested in $175 of shares in equity, and the bank gave you another $175 to invest. That gave you a total portfolio of $350. Your margin limit is 2 times. Now let's say come to tomorrow, for some reason the market had declined, and the market had declined by 14%. Right? Ignore the word gain. The market had declined by 14%. So what happens is that you only had $300, right, which is what your portfolio is worth, let's say tomorrow. Now the debt remains constant. The debt doesn't change. However, the value of your equity has diminished by $50. Now that is quite drastic, because what has really happened here is that margin has basically done one thing here. It has basically magnified the size of your losses, right? If you observe, right? So therefore resulting in a much lower margin limit or margin ratio. If you take A divided by B, the margin ratio has basically shrunk. Now, would this be a concern? Well, it depends on the bank arrangement. If the bank had made a requirement that you have to maintain above 2, then you are in deep soup, right? Deep trouble, right? But if the bank told you that the required margin limit is 1.5 times, then you are safe. So this really depends, right? Now, and a decrease in margin limit is basically affected by the size of your portfolio. So if your portfolio were to decrease any faster, your limit would also be affected. Now you may ask then, so what can you do to rectify this problem? If let's say the portfolio value has dropped so fast and that your margin limit has fallen that quickly and the bank is coming after you, well, there are two possible circumstances. Situation one is that the bank will ask you to sell off your shares, whatever quantity, so that the margin ratio can be restored. If not, increase the amount of equity in your account. Now, to increase the amount of equity in the account means that you will have to use cash. Alright? Now, if you have the cash, then option 2 is fine. Now, if you do not have the cash, then you have to sell off your shares. Right? Now, wait. If you are the only person affected by this, that's fine. But if you are not the only person being affected by this, imagine if half the population is affected by this, how many shares will be sold in the stock market? You can imagine the effect. If you have a lot of people selling down because of the stock index doing poorly, then basically everyone's portfolio would also be under pressure. Right. Now, like any bank product, there is this thing called margin limit or margin ratio. So this limit or credit limit restricts clients from excessive exposure. That's why you saw that I have this ratio here. This ratio is basically a bank's way of ensuring that you are not overexposed to borrowing or overexposed to share investments. Alright? And this, of course, by having such credit limit, it helps to protect the bank from having to face more risk. Right? So it's a risk management measure. Right? Now, bull runs basically make the portfolio perform much better. But of course, when you have bad times, then margins also magnify the worst by many more times as well. Which is why if you notice that during a sell down, the sell down can be extremely drastic. Like what you may have noticed in some charts, especially in some certain stock index charts, you may have noticed that the chart may fall. It may fall in this sudden pattern, drastic, but then it rebounces suddenly as well, if you notice, right? And part of the reason for this sudden drop is because of the process called deleveraging, where clients are asked to either top up cash to improve their margin limit, or clients are asked to sell their shares so that their limit can be improved. So that process is called that's where you have this process of deleveraging, right? When people can't pay cash, then they start selling, then this process of deleveraging becomes quite severe, quite significant. Now, of course, after topping up cash, what happens if, let's say, if the stock market does badly and the stock index goes into another fall? Well, you may have another round of deleveraging. Now, this deleveraging basically, in a way, cleans up much of the margin positions. So those fringe investors who don't really have the investing firepower, they are eliminated. So therefore, it will result in the stock market or the stock index stabilizing. Right? Now the question is that, when does this stock index really stabilize? Well, the thing is that no one really knows, because how much leverage people use or how much leverage investors use is really quite hard to tell, because some investors may not have used up all of their leverage. Some may still have a large amount of leverage that is still not yet utilized. Now, and this is the part which is worrying. What happens if the market falls again and then there is another period of deleveraging? Now that can be frightening, right? And that's something you need to be aware of when you invest using margin. And what can you do to actually defend yourself against this thing called margin calls? How do you protect a portfolio from situations where you fall below the margin limit which is required by the bank? Okay, so this product margin is like any other product developed to meet the needs of clients. It's very important to know what you are really dealing with. So before you actually start to use this, make sure that you understand what are the proper measures to take to guard against market downswings. Because when there is market downswing, the bank can either ask you to sell your shares, or the bank can ask you to do a top up of cash to build up the equity portion within the margin account. Now both measures are of course not very pleasant to know, right? And very important is that you have to realize and bear in mind that the market can actually move both ways, right? So it's really not fun to be caught by surprise, and you can never really tell when the market will turn the other way around. Now of course prudence dictates that the most ideal case is never to use margin, right? That's the most prudent course of action, right? And also considering the fact that movements can be either way, and the magnitude of such movements are often quite hard to predict. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is quite obvious. Margin is a very powerful tool, but then it's also a tool that can cut deeply. It is without doubt that there are temptations to use this to gamble, but one has to realize and understand where the boundaries are, right? And remember, if you're going to use margin right to your credit limit, you run very high risk of being called for cash top up or being asked to sell off your shares, which both are quite unpleasant, right? If you're losing money and if you're asked to sell off your shares, that isn't very pleasant to hear, right? Okay, finally, the discussion points in this video are purely for education purposes, and they are not intended to provide any advice, right? So what I have done here is just to share with you some of my thoughts and experiences with this product. I hope that this has been informative and also enabled you to take some important factors into consideration before using this instrument, right? And thank you for watching. I'm Will Chia, and you have been watching this on my YouTube channel. Thank you and have a good day.